So we're going to do report backs from all the groups. I think, Kari, are you leading us through this?
Sure. So I'll just call on one of the facilitators from each room for their 2 minutes. All right. So starting with JP, you're first.
Oh, yikes. Okay. So um we had a pretty good conversation. We talked about a lot of like what the actual um work of the jobs guarantee would look like for people. So comparing it to sort of like an apprenticeship and that being a path to future jobs for other people. And also, but a barrier there that we identified is that when people talk about the jobs guarantee, that's often kind of phrased in a very temporary manner when people talk about it, that these aren't permanent jobs. So if it is an apprenticeship, then to what job? So the example of like public schools was given. You could be essentially like a JG job in a paraprofessional position, but is that then transitioning to a teacher's job? And then we all know that the problems with public schools go a lot further than just like there's not enough teachers is like a very simplistic way of approaching that, right? And so the job guarantee wouldn't necessarily address those, the underfunding of public schools and things like that. We also talked about what it would actually look like to be like organizing as a jobs guarantee worker. Would you have a union? What labor law would you be under? Are you limited like other federal workers in only being able to like bargain a very limited amount of things? What effect does that have on the militancy of all of these jobs guarantee workers is something that I think is still an open question. We didn't have an answer for that, at least. Maybe other people on this call do. And then as far as getting the idea into the public more widely, treating it as a organizing question, and not just talking about maybe media or other ways, but actually building an organized constituency around it, organizing the unemployed around this issue, how to get labor bought in beyond just the comrades who are on the second call, because that's obviously only a very, very small segment of the labor movement, and how to get groups like DSA and community organizations behind the organized unemployed to fight for a jobs guarantee are all things we talked about. I hope that was my 2 minutes. I did not
Perfect.
have a stopwatch.
Wonderful. All right, Rebecca, you're up next, and I'll preview. So, and then Akshay, you'll be after that. So, Rebecca.
I figured I was number two. So we we talked a little bit about like the need for more educational materials, whether that comes through community groups or national DSA to help build toolkits with strategic talking points around, like if we're talking to a care worker or we're talking to an educator or we're talking to someone in the tech industry, like similar to what JP said, like, okay, this is we can get these skills, but then what, right? So like explaining that to someone in the tech industry, if I get skilled and trained through X, it leads me to what next? We spent a lot of time just talking about, just the need for materials in general to help with these conversations and messaging and getting things out. We also discussed really like the two sides of it, like from the bottom up, what does this look like? How do we organize? How do we talk to coworkers? And then leading it to, we know we need some top down sort of things and getting legislators involved, and we need legislation around it, but how do we pressure local legislators, right, to get on board with this? And how do we build pressure campaigns to say, if you're not, if you don't support this, then we're gonna find someone who will. So we kind of had a little talk about, rank and file versus other strategies. We talked about, let's see, I wrote it all down, connecting to social movements, and like how do we build on the momentum and continue the momentum that has already been built around these social movements and connect it to things like the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, Black Lives Matter, and really how do we create the need to see like getting on board with this is something that will then is essential to achieving so many other goals in those different spaces. And then, with just achieving socialism as the ultimate goal of this through this jobs guarantee. And I think that was really the nuts and bolts of what we talked about.
Great, perfect, thanks. All right, Akshay, you're next, and then after that will be Jamilah.
Thanks so much, Kari. Our group was number 3. Okay, great. Sorry, I wasn't sure if my audio was working. Thank you all for bearing with any of my difficulties on there, tech-wise, but we really got into, we had a very international crew, so folks from Canada to Costa Rica, so that was wonderful, and a lot of different contexts for the jobs guarantee. In Canada, it's not really on the top of the radar, and then as opposed to right now, even in Costa Rica, full employment is something that is kind of an active part of the conversation and discourse. So a lot of range, clearly, and I think we had some really good input as well about like what it would need to be won with the jobs guarantee. For example, a 20-hour work week to make something that could be absolutely tenable, and provide for a lot more job opportunities for those who want them, as well as providing a higher quality of life for all workers. And so we, especially with regards to decarbonization, there's a lot of hangups that we certainly still have to thanks, favorite shirt. There's a lot of hangups that we're still having to go through. We heard from folks that this is, again, there's no shortcuts to having conversations with fossil fuel workers about what the future looks like. We have to be, doing really a lot of one-on-one conversations, a lot of hard conversations. This has got to be done through really personal politics, as well as as we build a mass movement. And also that, because we're still hearing about it in certain places, there's still a lack of imagination around what a jobs guarantee could look like, or could it even exist? And so really trying to use our ongoing work to spark ideas about how we can conceive of the jobs guarantee as a reality. The last couple of things, we had some really great that's time, but social movements was a great piece, and we really need to link to anti-war immigration movements that we've done in the past to win big labor fights. Thank you.
Great, thanks. All right, Jamilah, you're next, and then after you will be Matt Haugen. I think we have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. We had a really healthy conversation around several of the questions. And one of the things that kept coming up from the people in my breakout session is, we had a lot of educators in my group. So they shared a lot of the experiences that they've had over the last year, with the COVID pandemic, and how that experience sort of started to shift the narrative within the public about the things that we've been told we can't have. And I think that that shift in narrative kind of brought out some hope and positivity in terms of starting to change the conversation around the jobs guarantee and other policies that we want to try and win, and how labor can have a significant role in that. I think the one thing that I think everyone agreed on is that it should be oversaw by the government, federal government that is, and the community should have a really heavy hand in the planning for what that jobs guarantee looks like. And in terms of how linking other social movements in this area was, and I love this. Someone in the group mentioned that the PRO Act campaign actually could give a great model for how we can bring two forces, sometimes opposing forces, together to work towards this common goal. And using the bringing labor and eco-socialists together is what we're doing on a PRO Act campaign. And that could be an interesting model towards how we can do social movements. And see that I'm at time. Thank you.
All right, so if you haven't gathered, I'm just kind of waving at people when you get to about 2 minutes. Feel free to wrap up your thought, but we'll keep it moving. So Matt Haugen, you're next, and then Sam Stockman.
All right, so a big theme we had was the need to expand people's imaginations and dreams with the job guarantee. One thing people talked about was pointing to existing government programs and how the military, things like the military sort of function as job guarantee right now. And then kind of using that to say, no, we can guarantee jobs that care for people and do socially useful work rather than violence. I need to have counter arguments to the idea that only certain people deserve benefits. So really talking about the guarantees and sort of expanding it to universal programs, that you don't need to do something to deserve things. And along with that idea, sort of politicizing budgets and like, we spend all this money on bad things, we could spend it on good things, with that expansionary MMT horizon. And to change people's minds and build support for it, we need to talk to everyone, and we need to bring people in as much as possible to make sure that it's the radical version we need, and get people to actually demand things. Just transitions often seen as empty words, which is why this needs to be a guarantee in these jobs. Not just jobs, but connect it to unions and housing and healthcare guarantees, and that can also connect it to other fights. And also addressing the scaremongering about the cost of a job guarantee. Talk about how the cost of the status quo is much higher in many ways, and show people that we are not just taking things away, but we're building something better. That's all I got.
Excellent. Five seconds short. All right, so Sam, you are up, and then after you will be Matthew Applebury.
All right, great, thanks. So I'm going to try to be quick and specific about what we did. We came away with 3 main themes in our very organically developing discussion. The first of those themes is that a great way to get the word out about the job guarantee is to utilize the personal connections that you have in your life around you and in your community. Several of the members of our breakout discussion group found about this particular meeting and discussions about the job guarantee through a friend of a friend who told them about it. So, that just speaks to the power that personal networking and your local connections can do. And they also discussed the need to circumvent, the dominant corporate media narratives, and that we have to find alternative ways to circumvent that, whether that's through local organizations or independent media that can spread the word. One of the second things that we discussed about is when we're thinking about jobs as kind of a bridge to something else, not just permanent jobs in the job guarantee, that we could definitely benefit from utilizing worker co-ops so that we're not just changing how we manage unemployment, but how we're managing work itself once someone potentially leaves the job guarantee. And that's another big thing that the policy should focus on. And lastly was a concern about the job guarantee that needs to be ironed out, is that there's concern that the current Congress will be unwilling to pass it, and that we need something short term that also addresses it. And they were interested in perhaps bridge policies or nudge legislation or something like that, and that the jobs in the job guarantee need to be focused on addressing carbon and reducing carbon emissions specifically first. And so those are the 3 main themes that we discussed.
Excellent. Well done. All right. So next we have Matthew Applebury and then Eli.
All right. So we talked about a lot of the things, actually, the other Matthew said. We've talked about expanding the public's imagination about what can be a job, what constitutes a job. They can go beyond just building infrastructure. It could also be arts, music, recording history, community history. In fact, this is stuff that was done already, decades ago. So that's another aspect, is bringing in that we've already done this in some capacity. And so we're capable of doing it again. I think that's important. Another thing we talked about was this UBI versus jobs guarantee thing, like busting up that dualist thinking, like it's either this or that, when in fact they're complementary. And so I think that could actually be beneficial. Let's see. yeah, there's always going to be work to be done. It's not just digging ditches and digging holes. So that's another part of expanding what could be a job. So, and also bringing in the moral angle. And so hammering on the dignity aspect of things. So that could bring people together to address what is, you know, the importance of having work, right? Another thing we talked about was that the private sector is not necessarily going to provide everything. And it's kind of the same thing with the 95 kids and 100, or the 95 aides, 100 kids. It's just not always going to be enough jobs for everybody. And then another aspect we talked about was that there's already so much waste right now. Unemployment causes so much like social harm, not only to individuals, but communities. So the cost of doing nothing, the cost of not having a job guarantee far surpass the cost of the job guarantee itself. And so another thing we talked about was upfront, like addressing the fact that we need to address people's fears about how much it costs, when in fact we can just address, we can look to MMT for that. So that's one thing we need to come up with right off the bat. So that's much as I can cram in there for 2 minutes.
Excellent use of the timer there. All right, so next we have Sam, and then we'll jump to Patricia.
I think it's actually me, but it's, yeah. Sam went, okay. My group talked a lot about the UBI versus job guarantee, concerns about creating avenues for people to be members of their community through useful labor, but also not wanting to valorize work as the only thing that makes you a part of the community. One thing we did talk about a lot was Dr. Darity's concern about replication of racial power dynamics if we allow the policy to be too localized, while also really desiring for this to be a structure that builds direct community democracy. And one of the ideas, which I kind of liked, is that this is a thing that data can really help us with. And if we have this express goal of addressing worst first, then we can build a job guarantee that that consistently benefits those parts of the economy and that are struggling the most, and those pieces of infrastructure that need to be reconstructed, I guess those that are in the worst shape. One thing we discussed at the end then is this question of whether a job guarantee should be a single minimum floor wage, which would mean that the work that it was hiring would be largely low skilled and unskilled work, or whether we would use a tiered system which would pay different wages for different skilled work levels. And the example I brought up was like, do we want a job guarantee that hires unemployed engineers or unemployed carpenters, or is the job guarantee just addressing this very low skilled, low wage work? Yeah, that's it.
Apologies for accidentally skipping you there, Eli. Thanks for
That's
jumping
fine.
in. So we'll go to Sam and then we'll do Patricia. All right.
All right, so in our group, we were talking about what sort of strategy we'll need to inform people about this. And so we were talking about sort of public outreach events, and especially on the local level. We're concerned that people would have hangups about the program being, maybe they think of it as too generous, or they ask the how do you pay for it question, or they would conflate it with other things like the COVID bill or these other programs that are happening. That people would think it was wasting money, or that it's subsidizing capitalism. And so we think it's really important that in our messaging, we define the program really clearly, emphasize that it's permanent, that it's its own thing, that it's separate from these other things. We talked about overcoming the hang up about people accusing us of, or accusing the program of involving too much bureaucracy. And I think the answer to that is to point to all the bureaucracy and costs and waste involved in the current system, that this would be replacing all the costs of unemployment. Our version of a job guarantee is a progressive version, and it involves like wraparound services as opposed to some sort of minimal or watered down version. And so to get that version, we were talking about what sort of strategies we need. One strategy would be to have minimal or pilot type programs that then build support for a more expansive vision. Another thing we could do would be to target vulnerable opponents. So people like Congress people who are in districts that are, swing districts that don't support the program enough, we could target that to build support for our version. We should be building coalitions, and especially we think we should be targeting organizations with overlapping goals that may or may not have been, people we would traditionally think of as our consistent allies on the left, but that would probably support this program. A lot of voters tend to be single issue focused. There's the issue they care about. And so we think if we can talk to these people in a problem-oriented language, so we can say, here's the problem you care about, and here's how the job guarantee helps solve it, that can build support within those groups. One thing that we think really is yet to be ironed out is the division of responsibility between federal and local governments on this program. So that's an open question, and I'll just end by saying that we're all convinced that the job guarantee would be transformational, Magna Carta-like, change the world and make it hard to understand what the world was like that, and we're excited. Thank you.
What an amazing way to end. Fantastic. All right. So Patricia, you are up next, and then Veronica.
Okay, ours was a bit of a mishmash of ideas, but I think it was all really good. So we started by talking about how what are the hang-ups that people have around the job guarantee, and the big one that came up was a lack of imagination, and I think people have already mentioned that. But there was this, I think we were more specific in our group in the sense that we said that there was a lot of skepticism about the power of the government to actually better people's lives in the US, and that that's tied into misconceptions about economics and a certain powerlessness of government that is a sign that needs to be addressed. But also about the fact that whenever you speak to people about the job guarantee, it's difficult for them to imagine just out of a hat what kind of jobs might be involved in this. And then, well, the other questions that come up as well is why not universal income? They don't necessarily see how the whole thing works. So some of the key points that we brought up to address this was that if we were able to make proposals more specific or kind of off the shelf, more ready to be implemented, including ideas for jobs that they could have, the whoever is going to implement the job guarantee at local level could already have ready and say, if we had a job guarantee, these would be our initial priorities, then that would really help put more kind of address that lack of imagination perhaps, and make the job guarantee more feasible in people's brains, as well as talk about all the bureaucracy and on how the system would work in practice and be more specific about that. All the things that came up was one of the other key questions that JG proponents need to iron out was that one of the things
you'll have to wrap up.
Okay, so one of the things that came up was about trade and what this would mean for trade policies and migration policies, and how do we make sure that migrants are included, and how do we go about making free trade agreements in the future on the basis of a job guarantee.
Great point to add in there. Veronica, you're up next, and then we'll have Maria and Sarah will go together to close this out.
Great. Hi, everyone. Veronica Wilson from Labor Network for Sustainability on Tongva land over in California. Thanks for listening. I'll try to be quick. I think I've heard so many of the report backs that have a lot of what we talked about, but a few really great takeaways. Start talking with friends. Connect folks who've been, working on this for a long time to folks who are just getting into it. Make sure there's some precision job guarantee versus jobs. We know that we're not really here to promote having to juggle 3 to 4 jobs just to survive. Workplace culture came up. A job or work could be a healthy thing, shouldn't have to be unhealthy, and how to get the organizing and talking to a national level of action. So getting the federal level action going, and having the climate crisis as an in. So centering the Green New Deal, need to have people working in all sectors. Many of the agenda items that were mentioned in the presentation as we got started, making sure that we're talking about public sector and uniting that with personal health and public health, or uniting personal and public health, I think was the point. And then connect to the youth movement, have classroom conversations at K-12, in math class, in social science, mitigate despair, and an outlook for the future for people on the planet. And definitely other resonating thoughts that have been mentioned, anti-war movement and immigrant rights and migrant rights, connecting with those. I'm going to check there.
Perfect. All right, so we will have Maria and Sarah. I don't know exactly how you want to do this. Well, we had to combine their groups there, so take it away.
Hi, I have been designated, but Maria, please jump in. We spent most of the time in our group about the hangups. We wanted to hear what things people had already been facing, many of which had already come up. We spent a good deal of time on the labor migration question and had a great example from Austria of sort of what that looks like for a certain age group and what struggles came up around the European Union. So that's something to look to. We also talked, of course, about the specter of big government and the fear that people have about that encroaching, and echoed things that came up earlier around, showing that there are times in which the government responds, and, imagining how much better things like the PPP could have been rolled out had we already had a program like this in place, but also like the efficacy of things like the military that we don't like, proves that that bureaucracy is not something that can't be wielded positively. And we spent some time talking about, how we would approach conversations in which people are UBI proponents, versus the jobs guarantee, and how is it that, for instance, maybe using something like, stay-at-home care work, the wages for housework idea, and how that we might want to frame, rather than providing a low sort of floor for people, how we might want to talk about elevating and making visible invisible work, and actually elevating that to the level of labor. And that's one example of why a jobs guarantee would be preferable over a UBI. Maria, anything you'd like to add?
No, that was about it, but it was a great conversation. So thanks to our group.
Wonderful. All right. And thank you all for keeping to the times as we went through. So that should leave us with a little bit of
Oh no, did we lose Kari for a second?
Kari's video froze.
There you are. Kari, we lost you for
back.
a second, but you're back. Great.
Okay, great. I realized you all froze and it says my internet connection is unstable. So I'll mute my video if it happens again. Okay, so just kind of thinking about some of the many themes that you guys brought up, I think we're clearly facing a challenge about public imagination right now. We face a really demoralized workforce. Capitalism's been really successful at, not to be too blunt about it, but alienating ourselves from our labor, right? But even alienating ourselves from what could be, what could make a good life and have more time off and things like that. And I think the job guarantee is one avenue of providing people with a practical way of thinking about what it would look like to change the system of work that as it exists in this country right now. from the perspective of, coming from this from the labor side, I know that there were a lot of questions that got down to kind of some of the nitty gritty, including just the recent, public workers in the chat, the item that came up. And I want to say, as somebody who represents some of those public sector workers, not all of these jobs are as good as you assume they are. I hate to say that, but just because a job has a union representing someone doesn't mean they've been successful at reaching a really high wage floor or really great benefits or good safety protections. And that in part has been made worse over the last several years in the public sector by an attack from the private sector trying to subcontract out a lot of that work, right? So jobs that used to be good public sector jobs are not necessarily those jobs anymore, right? So something that a job guarantee could do is provide basically more state and municipal funding to fully fund those kinds of jobs, which should be good jobs and which have been eroded. And then there are places around the country where workers don't have any collective bargaining rights in North Carolina and South Carolina, and they barely have some in Virginia. And these kinds of jobs are not good jobs, right? So how can we use this idea of a job guarantee to create more equity is, I think, a primary way of getting this idea out to a broader constituency. And I do think these questions about bureaucracy are a little bit of a challenge for this imagination, right? Because people have very much gotten caught up in the idea that bureaucracy is always faulty because we haven't had good experiences, but what ways might technology allow us to reconstruct some of these kinds of problems that have existed in communication across bureaucratic channels in the past? Maybe there are some possibilities that this pandemic moment of being able to explore different ways of interacting with each other, even when we're not in the same geographic space, can allow us to, explore some new ideas going forward. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I'm going to be bringing forward into our work that will come after this, I know there are some questions that kind of lead towards that in the chat, is this big question of how do we move this idea forward? And I'm glad people are talking about one-on-one type organizing conversations. And I'd certainly encourage folks to learn more about what that looks like to really move people over the course of a conversation. We can help teach you some skills from the labor movement that can be applied to other kinds of sectors, right? To do that piece of work. And the challenge is, of course, that's slow. And one of our biggest problems right now is time, especially as we think about the job guarantee as something that helps us to address the climate crisis. How can we get down to, having conversations that convince people in one-on-ones or small group settings, but at the scale and under the time pressures that we have to be effective in really addressing climate change? This is something that, our union is certainly thinking about. I know many others are as well. And this is one of those areas to think about. Where can partnerships with other kinds of on-the-ground groups come in to get more people out there initiating some of these conversations? And I think I'll just sort of close with, thinking about some of the ideas from week 2 that help to shift this mindset, in that there is plenty of work to go around. There's plenty of capital that's out there. The problem is that there are too many people hoarding it from us, right? And we need to change, as Derek was talking about this morning, we need to change our expectations for how we share that wealth with each other. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Fidel.
Thank you, Kari. And before I go into my comments, I want to thank again Kari and Ashik and Aaron for wonderful work behind the scenes for making this whole thing happen the last 3 weeks and several weeks in the making. So a couple of messages about what we're doing here and what we're hoping to accomplish moving forward after these 3 weeks. Number one is recognizing that the work that we're doing is about educating each other, empowering each other, and mobilizing to fight for a better future, right? We're not going to just fight with no strategy. So number two, recognizing what we're fighting for and who is blocking us, right? So the fights are not between those of us who support the job guarantee versus those of us progressives who support UBI. The fights are not between workers here in the US versus workers in the global South. The fights are not between teachers and parents. That's just, distraction. The real fight is about who is blocking the labor movement, the progressive social movement, from doing what we're trying to do. So what are our goals? And I stated this on day one. Our goals are the following, and we can afford all of these goals. Call their bluff when they say we can't, we don't have the money. We can afford universal public services, that is healthcare, education, green infrastructure, childcare, all of these things, we can afford them. So set that as a national priority and fight for that. Number two, for people who want to work, and millions of people want to work with decent wages and benefits, we fight for a job guarantee for people who want to work. Number three, for people who can't work for a variety of reasons, we fight for basic income support, make it generous, make it dignified for anyone who's not able to participate in the economy in the way we laid out. So it's not either or. We set the priority straight and we can afford all of these things. In terms of how do we pay for it, this very ambitious Green New Deal, green infrastructure, and you hear it in the news all the time. Inflation is right around the corner. We can't afford all of this thing. And we're going to bankrupt the country. We're going to turn into Venezuela, all of this nonsense you hear on TV. Call their bluff, because they never argue we can't afford additional military spending, or we can't afford the COVID relief bill, or the $1.9 trillion. Who did we tax? Who did we borrow from? That's not how it works. At the federal level, the federal government spends money into existence on national priorities. And then we worry about the risk of inflation by taxing and regulating market power out of existence, by building additional productive capacity so we don't run out of resources. And we know how to do this. We've done it during World War II. We've done it every time, except when we say we want the job guarantee, when we say climate action, they say, oh, we're out of money. We can't borrow more. We can't have additional national debt. So education and empowerment is really meant to allow us to push back and call their bluff. Now, they're not going to do it because the existing power structure is not a government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? That's what democracy is supposed to be. It's a government of the super PACs for the super PACs. So it's not teachers against parents. It's not workers here against workers in the global South. It's not pro UBI or pro job guarantee. We're talking about democracy fundamentally here. We have forces that suffocate the system and tell us we can't afford a job guarantee. So here's a tagline for you. The cost of doing nothing, which is the status quo, is unaffordable. That's the too expensive part. So if you're fiscally conservative, forget about MMT for a second. If you're fiscally conservative, we're spending trillions of dollars on the opioid crisis. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars building prisons as opposed to building schools and educational resources. We say we'd rather not spend money on cleaning the water sources and having a clean energy system, but then we spend trillions of dollars on the cost of healthcare for the next 30 years to treat cancer, to treat illnesses and all kinds of things. What we're saying is we're going for the healthier, more resilient, more sustainable, more equitable society, and we can do it at a fraction of the current cost without any of the economic pain. We're already paying for it with blood, tears, and money as we speak. And we're opting for a better, more prosperous, more just future. And the job guarantee is a core feature of it. It's not a nice add-on to put on top of a Green New Deal. So the just transition, and I'll close with this, can be an empty promise. And it has been an empty promise for many workers in the past. We cannot afford to sell another empty promise, especially to fossil fuel workers in this climate emergency and this transition that we need, which means we can't tell fossil fuel workers, quit your union job, fight for a Green New Deal, and we promise you, you're gonna let go of this job that pays you, I don't know, 100 plus 120K in some cases for fossil fuel workers. And there's these solar jobs that are not unionized, at least not at the same rate, that pay 75K, and go get the training, you pay for it out of pocket, and maybe you'll find a job. That's nonsense, and pension benefits and all that, which means we have to underwrite, by we, I mean the federal government must underwrite the cost of the just transition as a guaranteed transition to a green, clean economy for fossil fuel workers and any other workers that are displaced with the same package of wages and benefits and pensions and so on. Otherwise, we can't ask them to sacrifice their livelihood and their quality of life and their pension for the sake of a just transition with empty promises. So if we're not fighting for that, they're not going to join us. I guarantee you. And I'm not going to be disappointed in workers trying to protect their interests. It's totally understandable, but we can't afford this idea. So the fight again is not between fossil fuel workers and green activists. We should be on the same side. So we need to know what is it that we're fighting for as a unit, as a group, to transition into this clean and green and sustainable and prosperous economy. And with that, I'd like to invite my colleague Andreas from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation to lead us into some closing comments. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much. Time is already a bit late, so I will keep my comments short. Federal job guarantee is not a new idea, but it might be an idea of which the time has come when we think about the Green New Deal, when we think about a just transition and all the burning tasks this country and the world has in front of themselves. So it is, as we heard today, especially connected with a lot of problems still, but I think it's worth working on it, and we can achieve something if we follow up and build power around it and behind it, so that will lead us to a world. And we're also talking, especially in my group, about the potential that this transforming potential that is in this idea. And so it's definitely worth to follow up with that. And this might only have been the first part of a work that has to be continued. I'd like to thank all the facilitators today for their excellent work in the breakout sessions. I'd like to thank all the speakers of the whole series. Julie Ansel, Sydney Gazarian, Sandy Derrity, Sarah Nelson, Carl Rosen, Kian Liberato, and today Dr. Derek Hamilton. And I'd like to especially thank the people who organized the series. Fadel Kaboub of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Kari Thompson of UE, always a pleasure to work with you, and Ashik Sadikov of DSA Eco-Socialists, together with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung's project manager, Aaron, who especially deserves a lot of thanks for also doing the whole paperwork that is behind the scenes. So, I'd like to remind you that you can find the links to all the sessions on our YouTube channel, Rosa Lux NYC. And I also want to do a little advertising for another really great series that Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Berlin, I think, is doing. It's sponsoring a training and networking program for organizers worldwide. Over the past 18 months, lead educator Jane McAlevey and a team of global trainers have worked with around 12,000 organizers from over 70 countries. The next training will be, sorry, I lost my line. The next training will be named Workers Rising Everywhere. It kicks off on May 18 and is open to registration for all groups of 10 plus. You can find out more under the link I'm posting right now. Oh, Aaron was quicker than I was. And you may sign up by May 3rd here. So, and of course, I would like to thank everyone who took the time today. I know it's not easy for everyone to be around during daytime. A lot of people have to work and have to make it possible. The more I want to thank you, and I hope we will all follow up and spread the word, and let's make it real. Thank you very much, and goodbye.